November 14th, 1965. The Central Highlands of Vietnam. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore stood in the door of a Huey helicopter, watching the jungle canopy rush beneath him at 120 miles per hour. In just minutes, he would lead 450 men of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry in a landing zone X-ray. A small clearing carved into the Ia Drang Valley. Moore was a 43-year-old West Point graduate, a veteran of the Korean War, a man who had spent months training his battalion for this moment. He had studied military history obsessively, read every book on infantry tactics he could find, drilled his men until they could operate as one organism. Now all that preparation was about to be tested in the crucible of combat. Moore had no idea that 3 regiments of North Vietnamese regulars were waiting below. Over 2,000 battle-hardened soldiers who had been moving through the jungle for weeks. Men who had fought the French at Dien Bien Phu, who knew this terrain intimately, who had orders to destroy the American unit, to test the new air cavalry tactics that the United States was so proud of, to prove that the American army could be beaten, that technology and firepower meant nothing in the jungle. What followed would be 3 days of the most savage, close-quarters combat of the entire Vietnam War. A battle where the fighting was so intense that men ran out of ammunition and fought with entrenching tools, knives, and their bare fists. Where artillery fired danger-close missions just 30 yards from American positions. Where the margin between life and death was measured in seconds. Where helicopter pilots flew into walls of enemy fire again and again to bring in reinforcements and evacuate the wounded. Where the jungle itself became an enemy as deadly as the North Vietnamese soldiers. This is the story of the Battle of Ia Drang, the first major engagement between American forces and the North Vietnamese army. A battle that would set the template for years of brutal jungle warfare to come. A battle where both sides would claim victory, where strategies would be proven and disproven, where 79 American soldiers would make the ultimate sacrifice in a small clearing that most of them had never heard of before that morning. This is a story of courage and fear, of leadership and chaos, of men pushed beyond what they thought were their limits, and discovering what they were truly capable of when everything was on the line. To understand what happened at Ia Drang, you must first understand the revolutionary concept that brought Moore's battalion to that remote valley in the first place. The 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile was an entirely new type of military unit, the first of its kind in the history of warfare. Instead of trucks and armored vehicles, it relied almost entirely on helicopters. Hundreds of them. Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopters, known to every soldier as Hueys. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of their rotors would become the defining sound of the Vietnam War. The idea behind air mobility was simple but radical. Helicopters could move infantry rapidly across Vietnam's difficult terrain. Mountains, jungles, rice paddies, rivers, swamps, none of these obstacles mattered anymore. A battalion could be airlifted into combat in less than an hour, resupplied by air throughout the battle, evacuated by air when the mission was complete. The helicopter promised a level of mobility and firepower that no ground-bound enemy could possibly match. Or so the theory went. Major General Harry Kennard commanded the 1st Cavalry Division. He was a visionary who believed absolutely in the concept of air mobility. He handpicked Harold Moore to lead one of his battalions precisely because Moore shared that vision. But Moore was also a realist. He understood that air mobility was completely untested in combat against a determined enemy. That all the theories developed at Fort Benning and Fort Rucker had never faced North Vietnamese regulars who were willing to die to prove those theories wrong. So Moore drove his soldiers hard in the months before deployment to Vietnam. Physical conditioning until men could march 20 miles with full packs. Weapons training until every soldier could field strip and reassemble his M16 rifle blindfolded. Small unit tactics practiced again and again in the pine forests of Georgia. He emphasized fire discipline and controlled aggression. Every man learned to operate the radio, to call for artillery fire and air support, to read a map and use a compass, to fight as part of a cohesive team rather than as individuals. Moore told his men repeatedly that they were going to write the book on airmobile warfare, that future generations of soldiers would study what they accomplished. He was right about that, but the lessons would be written in blood. More blood than any of them could have imagined that humid morning as the helicopters approached landing zone X-ray. In early November 1965, intelligence reports began indicating unusual enemy activity in the Central Highlands near the Cambodian border. Radio intercepts picked up increased communications in military codes. Aerial reconnaissance spotted evidence of large troop movements. Not Viet Cong guerrillas in black pajamas, but regular North Vietnamese army units in proper uniforms with heavy weapons. Battalion-sized units at minimum, perhaps even regimental strength. The 1st Cavalry Division received orders to find and destroy these forces before they could threaten American installations in the region. The operation was designated Silver Bayonet. The target area was Pleiku Province, one of the most remote regions of South Vietnam, a landscape of mountains covered in triple canopy jungle. The Ia Drang Valley ran along the Cambodian border like a natural highway. Intelligence officers believed the North Vietnamese were using it as a primary infiltration route to move men and supplies from sanctuaries in Cambodia into South Vietnam. On November 10th, those suspicions were dramatically confirmed. A Special Forces camp at Plei My came under heavy attack by what appeared to be a full North Vietnamese regiment. The assault was eventually beaten back with the help of massive air strikes and artillery fire. But it proved beyond any doubt that regular NVA forces were in the area in significant numbers, and they were willing to attack fortified positions in broad daylight. General Kennard ordered an immediate search and destroy mission. He wanted to find the enemy base camps in the Ia Drang Valley, to bring the NVA to battle on American terms, to use superior mobility and firepower to inflict devastating casualties, to send a message that North Vietnamese forces couldn't operate with impunity in South Vietnam. Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, drew the assignment. They would conduct an air assault into the Ia Drang Valley, search for enemy forces, engage them, and call in artillery and air strikes to destroy them. Moore studied the maps and aerial photographs carefully for hours. The valley was incredibly remote, heavily forested with few clearings large enough for helicopter operations. The nearest firebase was 8 miles away at Landing Zone Falcon. If his battalion got into serious trouble, help would take precious time to arrive. He would be counting heavily on his artillery support and the helicopter gunships that would escort his assault, and on the courage and training of his soldiers. What the intelligence reports didn't tell Moore was that he would be landing his battalion directly on top of a major North Vietnamese staging area. That 3 full regiments, totaling more than 4,000 enemy soldiers, were converging on the exact area he had chosen for his landing zone. November 14th dawned hot and clear over Camp Holloway near Pleiku. Perfect flying weather. The Huey pilots gathered for their mission briefing at 0800 hours. They would be flying into an area where enemy presence was confirmed. Anti-aircraft fire was possible. Every helicopter would carry door gunners with M60 machine guns. The lead gunships would be armed with rockets and miniguns. At 10:48 in the morning, the first wave of 16 Hueys lifted off in a roar of turbine engines and beating rotors. Each helicopter carried exactly 8 fully equipped soldiers. Rifles, ammunition, grenades, rations, water. Each man carried close to 80 pounds of equipment in the tropical heat. Moore was in the lead aircraft along with his radio operators and sergeant major. As battalion commander, he insisted on being first on the ground. It was a leadership principle he believed in absolutely. Never ask your men to go where you won't go first. Never give an order you wouldn't carry out yourself. The flight took exactly 20 minutes. The helicopters flew in tight formation just a few hundred feet above the jungle canopy. As they approached the landing zone, door gunners test-fired their M60 machine guns in short control bursts. The hot brass casings ejected out into space, tumbling down into the jungle below. The clearing Moore had designated as Landing Zone X-ray came into view. It was small, perhaps 100 yards across at its widest point, just barely big enough for 8 Hueys to land simultaneously. It sat at the base of Chu Pong Mountain, which rose steeply to the west. Dense jungle surrounded the clearing on all sides, trees so thick that a man could barely walk through them in some places. Moore had picked this landing zone because it was the only suitable clearing within miles. He had no way of knowing that he had chosen a spot less than 1 mile from the field headquarters of the 66th North Vietnamese Regiment. That enemy scouts had already spotted his helicopters and were reporting his approach. The Hueys flared and touched down in a storm of rotor wash and red dust. Moore jumped out before the skids fully touched the ground. His command group followed immediately, spreading out and dropping into firing positions. The soldiers of Bravo Company's 1st Platoon fanned out to secure the landing zone perimeter. Training took over. Every man knew exactly what to do. There was no enemy fire. The jungle was eerily silent, except for the fading thunder of helicopter rotors as the first wave lifted off to make room for the next. Within 2 minutes, the first 80 men were on the ground, and the helicopters were racing back to Camp Holloway for the next lift. Moore quickly established his command post near a large termite mound in the center of the clearing. It would provide some protection and a reference point. He watched through binoculars as his companies began moving out into the jungle according to the plan they had rehearsed. Bravo Company pushed west toward the Cambodian border. Alpha Company, under Captain Tony Nadal, moved northwest directly toward Chu Pong Mountain. Charlie Company secured the landing zone itself and prepared to send out patrols. Delta Company was still back at Camp Holloway, waiting for their turn in the airlift sequence. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The landing zone was designated X-ray. In less than 3 hours, it would become a name that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. At 12:15 in the afternoon, Alpha Company was approximately 300 yards northwest of the landing zone, moving slowly through dense jungle. The heat was oppressive. Soldiers were already soaked with sweat. Visibility was limited to 20 or 30 feet in most places. The point squad was being extra cautious, weapons ready, expecting contact at any moment. Then a North Vietnamese soldier walked almost directly into 2nd Lieutenant Al Devney's platoon. The Americans opened fire immediately. The enemy soldier went down hard. For a split second, there was silence. Then all hell broke loose. Enemy fire erupted from what seemed like every direction at once. Not scattered shots, but heavy, sustained fire from automatic weapons and rifles. Alpha Company had walked into a North Vietnamese fighting position. Within seconds, men were hitting the ground, returning fire, screaming for medics. Captain Tony Nadal dropped beside a tree and tried to assess the situation through the chaos. His radio crackled with reports from all 3 of his platoons. They were in heavy contact, taking casualties. The enemy was well concealed in spider holes and fighting positions, some so close that hand grenades were being exchanged. This wasn't a small patrol they had stumbled into. The volume and accuracy of fire indicated a much larger force. Nadal got on the radio to Moore. His voice was calm despite the circumstances. "We have heavy contact. Multiple automatic weapons. Taking casualties. Need artillery support immediately." Moore listened to the radio traffic with growing concern. He could hear the gunfire in the background of Nadal's transmission, hear the controlled urgency in his voice. This was developing into a serious engagement. He made immediate decisions. First, he ordered Bravo Company to cease their western movement and swing north to hit the enemy from the flank. Second, he called for artillery fire from landing zone Falcon 8 miles away. The fire direction center acknowledged immediately. Moore gave them the coordinates. Danger close to Alpha Company's position. The artillery crews went into action with practiced efficiency. Within 4 minutes of Moore's initial request, the first salvo was screaming overhead. The rounds impacted less than 100 yards in front of Alpha Company's forward elements. The explosions were so close that American soldiers could feel the heat and pressure waves. Dirt and shrapnel rained down on them, but the artillery bought them precious breathing room. The North Vietnamese fire slackened temporarily as enemy soldiers took cover from the barrage. The battle was now fully joined. What Moore didn't know yet, what he couldn't know, was the true scale of what he was facing. He had landed his battalion directly on top of a major North Vietnamese staging area. The 33rd and 66th Regiments of the People's Army of Vietnam were in the immediate vicinity. The 32nd Regiment was force marching to join them. In total, more than 4,000 enemy soldiers. Well-trained regulars, many of them veterans of years of warfare. They were equipped with AK-47 assault rifles, RPG rocket launchers, heavy machine guns, and mortars. And their commander, Senior Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Huyen, had already made his tactical decision. He would mass his forces and destroy the American unit before reinforcements could arrive. He would prove that air mobility was a failed concept, that American soldiers couldn't stand up to determined North Vietnamese fighters in close combat. By early afternoon, Moore had gotten most of his battalion on the ground, but Alpha Company was still heavily engaged and taking casualties. Bravo Company was fighting through thick jungle, trying to reach them and hit the enemy's flank. The sound of battle was continuous now. Rifle fire, machine guns, grenade explosions, and the thunder of artillery impacting in the jungle. Charlie Company was spread thin around the landing zone perimeter. They could hear the fighting, but weren't yet engaged themselves. The helicopters kept coming despite the increasing danger. Every few minutes, another wave of Hueys would swoop in, discharge their troops, and lift off. Door gunners fired constantly as they approached and departed. Enemy snipers had climbed into the trees around the landing zone. They were shooting at every helicopter. Several aircraft took hits. One Huey crashed just outside the perimeter, the crew rescued by Charlie Company soldiers who ran through enemy fire to pull them out. But the pilots kept flying. They understood viscerally that Moore needed every man on the ground if the battalion was going to survive what was coming. Captain Ramon Tony Nadal, Bravo Company commander and brother to Alpha Company's captain, led his men in a desperate push toward Alpha's position. But the jungle fought them as much as the enemy did. Vines grabbed at equipment. Roots tripped soldiers carrying heavy loads. The heat was suffocating. Men were gulping water from their canteens, knowing they would run out soon. And all the while they were taking fire from an enemy they could barely see. The North Vietnamese were masters of jungle warfare and camouflage. They would lie motionless in spider holes until Americans were just feet away, then open fire at point-blank range before melting back into the jungle. By mid-afternoon, Moore made the crucial decision that would save his battalion. Instead of continuing to push companies out into the jungle toward Chupong Mountain, he would consolidate his forces, form a tight defensive perimeter around the landing zone, bring in his reserve company, and prepare to hold through the night. His instincts told him that the North Vietnamese would attack in force, probably after darkness fell. His men would need every possible advantage to survive as late afternoon shadows began lengthening across landing zone X-ray. One element of Moore's battalion found itself in particularly desperate circumstances. 2nd Platoon of Charlie Company, led by 24-year-old Lieutenant Henry Herrick, had pursued a group of retreating North Vietnamese soldiers too far from the main perimeter. What Herrick didn't know was that he was being deliberately lured into a trap. Now his platoon of 29 men was cut off, completely surrounded on a small knoll about 500 yards northwest of the landing zone. Herrick's platoon had been chasing what appeared to be a small enemy patrol when they suddenly found themselves under devastating fire from 3 sides. The volume of incoming rounds was staggering. The North Vietnamese had waited until the Americans were in a kill zone before opening up. Herrick immediately tried to pull his men back toward the main perimeter, but was already too late. The enemy had moved behind them with terrifying speed. The platoon was trapped. 29 young American soldiers, now fighting for their lives on a piece of ground that wasn't even on their maps. Herrick was hit early in the engagement while trying to rally his men and organize a defense. He took a round through the chest and died within minutes, calling for his men to keep fighting. Sergeant Ernie Savage, a tough career NCO from North Carolina, took command of what was left. The platoon tried to form a defensive circle on the small rise, but the terrain worked against them. The North Vietnamese were in heavy jungle just yards away, so close that grenades were being exchanged. Some hand-to-hand fighting broke out as enemy soldiers tried to overrun the position. The Americans fought with everything they had: rifles, grenades, knives, and trenching tools. Several men were hit multiple times but kept fighting. Savage moved constantly around the perimeter despite wounds, directing fire, encouraging his soldiers, refusing to let them give up. Moore desperately wanted to launch an immediate rescue mission. Every instinct told him to send a company to fight their way to Herrick's position. But he couldn't do it. He simply couldn't weaken his main perimeter with a major enemy attack expected at any moment. If he sent a company out and the North Vietnamese hit the landing zone in force, the entire battalion could be overrun. It was the hardest decision a commander can make. Herrick's men would have to hold on their own until morning. Moore got on the radio to Savage personally. He promised the sergeant that he would get them out. That help was coming, but they had to survive the night first. The artillery forward observers went to work immediately to support the isolated platoon. As the sun began setting over the Central Highlands, Moore worked frantically to prepare his battalion for the attack he knew was coming. The perimeter that had formed around Landing Zone X-Ray was roughly circular, approximately 200 yards in diameter. Charlie Company held the southern and southeastern side of the perimeter. Alpha Company, battered but still combat effective, held the northwestern sector closest to Chu Pong Mountain. Bravo Company filled in the northern edge, and Delta Company, which had finally been completely airlifted in during the afternoon, took responsibility for the eastern side facing the Ia Drang River. In the center was Moore's command post and the battalion aid station. Already the aid station was overwhelmed with wounded men. The battalion surgeon and his medics worked frantically to stabilize the most serious cases for helicopter evacuation. But as darkness approached, the medevac flights had to stop. It was simply too dangerous to fly helicopters into the landing zone at night, with enemy forces so close. The wounded would have to wait until morning. Ammunition was redistributed. Men with extra magazines shared with those running low. Grenades were passed to positions where they would be most needed. Claymore mines, deadly anti-personnel weapons that fired hundreds of steel balls, were set up facing outward all around the perimeter. Machine gun crews dug in their M60s and established interlocking fields of fire. Moore established direct radio contact with the artillery battery at Landing Zone Falcon. He wanted to pre-plan defensive concentrations, specific coordinates where artillery could be fired immediately on call. The artillery forward observers worked with company commanders to plot these targets all around the perimeter and in the jungle approaches. They would need artillery fire fast when the attack came. There would be no time for lengthy target calculations. Moore also coordinated with the Air Force liaison officer. Fast-moving jets loaded with bombs and napalm were being held on strip alert at Pleiku. They could be overhead in minutes if needed. But dropping ordnance, danger close, to friendly positions at night would be incredibly risky. It would take skilled pilots and precise target coordinates. As full darkness fell, the temperature dropped slightly, but the humidity remained oppressive. The jungle came alive with sounds. Insects, night birds, and other creatures created a constant background noise, which made listening for enemy movement nearly impossible. Moore ordered his men to maintain 50% alert, half awake, half trying to rest. Every soldier knew that rest would be impossible. Artillery illumination rounds began bursting overhead, their parachute flares casting eerie, swaying shadows through the jungle. The light helped, but it also destroyed night vision and created deeper shadows where enemy soldiers could hide. Out on the isolated knoll, Sergeant Savage and his remaining men prepared for what they knew would be the longest night of their lives. At exactly 9:30 p.m., the North Vietnamese struck, not with a probing attack or reconnaissance by fire. A full regimental assault. Hundreds of soldiers charging the American perimeter from multiple directions simultaneously. The attackers came in waves, blowing bugles and whistles, shouting and screaming as they ran. Many were firing their AK-47 .47s from the hip as they charged. The muzzle flashes lit up the jungle like a deadly lightning storm. The American response was immediate and overwhelming. Every rifle, every machine gun, every grenade launcher opened fire at once. The M60 machine guns hammered out long bursts, their tracers creating red lines through the darkness. Soldiers fired their M16 rifles on full automatic, changing magazines as fast as they could. Claymore mines detonated in massive sheets of flame and steel, cutting down entire groups of attackers. Artillery rounds impacted just beyond the perimeter with tremendous explosions that shook the ground. The noise was absolutely indescribable. A continuous, mind-numbing roar that made communication almost impossible even by shouting. Officers and NCOs moved along the perimeter, directing fire, repositioning soldiers, making sure no section was overwhelmed. The North Vietnamese displayed incredible courage bordering on fanaticism. They kept coming despite devastating casualties. Bodies were piling up in front of the American positions. In some places they were stacked 2 and 3 deep. But still the attackers came, driven forward by officers and political commissars, determined to overrun the landing zone and annihilate Moore's battalion. In several places, enemy soldiers reached the perimeter. On the southern side, North Vietnamese troops broke through between 2 American positions and got inside the defensive line. A desperate, chaotic hand-to-hand fight erupted in the darkness. Soldiers clubbed each other with rifle butts, stabbed with bayonets, grappled and fought with knives and bare hands. Men were killed at arm's length in the flickering light of artillery illumination rounds. Sergeant Major Basil Plumley, Moore's right-hand man and a tough-as-nails career soldier, personally led a counterattack with a hastily assembled group of headquarters troops. They threw grenades into the breach and then charged in with rifles blazing. The hand-to-hand fighting was savage and brief. Within minutes, the enemy soldiers inside the perimeter were all dead or driven back out. But it had been close, terrifyingly close. The North Vietnamese had nearly broken through. All along the perimeter, similar fights were developing. Enemy soldiers would mass in the jungle just beyond the American positions, then charge in a human wave, accepting horrific casualties to try to reach the defensive line. The Americans would cut them down with machine gun fire and grenades. Then another wave would come from a different direction. The attacks were coordinated and relentless. Clearly, this was a well-planned assault by professional soldiers, not a spontaneous action by guerrillas. The artillery support was absolutely crucial to holding the perimeter. Fire direction control at landing zone Falcon processed requests with incredible speed and accuracy. Throughout that endless night, Harold Moore seemed to be everywhere at once, moving constantly around the perimeter despite the danger, encouraging his men, directing fire to threatened sectors, calling in artillery missions, making instant tactical decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Soldiers would later say that his presence made all the difference, that knowing the old man was there, right in the thick of it, sharing every danger, gave them strength when they had nothing left. The artillery crews at landing zone Falcon 8 miles away worked like well-oiled machines. They fired continuously throughout the night, loading, firing, loading again in an endless cycle. The gun barrels got so hot that the paint burned off and the metal glowed dull red in the darkness. Crews rotated on and off the guns to avoid heat exhaustion. By dawn, they would have fired more than 18,000 rounds in support of Moore's battalion. The Air Force also played a vital role when the situation became most desperate. When the North Vietnamese massed for a major push, Moore would call for airstrikes. F-100 Super Sabres screamed in low over the jungle, their afterburners lighting up the night sky. They dropped napalm canisters and high-explosive bombs within 300 yards of the American positions. The pilots flew with incredible precision in the darkness, using only the light from artillery illumination rounds to identify their targets. Their strikes broke up several enemy assaults before they could fully develop, buying crucial time for the defenders. By midnight, the intensity of the North Vietnamese attacks began to decrease slightly. The enemy was regrouping, treating casualties, planning the next assault. Moore used every lull to redistribute ammunition and strengthen weak points in the defensive line. Soldiers shared their remaining magazines with buddies who had shot themselves dry. Medical personnel worked by flashlight to treat the wounded, though there was little they could do except stop bleeding and ease pain until helicopter evacuation could resume at dawn. The Battalion 8 station was overwhelmed. Injured men lay in rows on the ground, waiting for treatment. Some quietly, others crying out in pain. The medics triaged as best they could, treating the most serious wounds first. Out on the isolated knoll, Sergeant Savage and his decimated platoon were still somehow holding on. By the grace of God and the skill of the artillery forward observers, they had survived through the darkness. The artillery had created a protective ring of steel and high explosive around their position. But the fire missions had to be called in almost continuously. Every time there was a pause, the North Vietnamese would probe the perimeter, trying to find a weak spot, trying to overrun the position before dawn. Several times during the night, enemy soldiers got close enough to throw grenades into the American position. The soldiers would throw them back or dive on them to protect their buddies. Acts of incredible heroism were happening in that darkness. Heroes were being made whose names would never be known outside their small circle of brothers. November 15th dawned gray and cool over landing zone X-ray. As first light filtered through the jungle canopy, Moore surveyed his perimeter with exhausted eyes. What he saw was beyond description. Dead North Vietnamese soldiers lay everywhere. In some places they were stacked 3 and 4 deep. The smell of death hung heavy in the humid morning air. Hundreds of AK-47 rifles littered the ground. Equipment, packs, ammunition, and all the other detritus of battle covered every square foot. The jungle itself had been transformed. Trees were shattered by artillery and small arms fire. Vegetation was torn apart and burned. The ground was cratered with shell holes. It looked like photographs Moore had seen of the Western Front in World War I. His own men were in desperate shape. They had been fighting continuously for over 20 hours. Ammunition was critically low across the entire battalion. Some positions had only a few magazines left. Soldiers were exhausted beyond anything they had experienced in training. Filthy, unshaven, many wounded, all of them pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. But they were alive. They had held. As soon as there was enough light for safe helicopter operations, the Hueys began arriving, bringing desperately needed ammunition, water, and medical supplies, taking out the most seriously wounded who had been waiting all night for evacuation. The door gunners reported that they could see enemy bodies stretching back into the jungle in every direction. Hundreds of them, perhaps more than 1,000. The North Vietnamese had paid a terrible price for their night attacks. Moore's immediate priority was rescuing 2nd Platoon. He ordered Alpha Company, under Captain Nadal, to fight their way to the isolated position at first light. They would be supported by every available artillery gun and aircraft. Nadal's men moved out as soon as they had been resupplied with ammunition. They fought through continued strong resistance. The North Vietnamese had not withdrawn. Despite their casualties, they were still in the area in force, still fighting. Every yard of jungle was contested. Small, vicious firefights erupted without warning, often at ranges of just a few meters. Artillery fire walked ahead of Alpha Company, pounding suspected enemy positions. Airstrikes hit targets on the flanks. Slowly, yard by bloody yard, Alpha Company advanced toward the knoll where Savage and his men waited. It took most of the morning to cover 500 yards. The terrain and the enemy resistance made movement agonizingly slow. But Nadal kept his men moving forward. He wouldn't leave those soldiers out there another minute, if he could help it. At 11:15 in the morning, Alpha Company's lead elements finally reached 2nd Platoon's position. What they found shocked even battle-hardened veterans. The ground was covered with spent brass casings, empty magazines, and grenade pins. Blood was everywhere. Dead Americans lay where they had fallen, still clutching their weapons. Of the 29 men who had been cut off the previous afternoon, only 12 could walk. 8 were dead, including Lieutenant Herrick. The rest were wounded, some seriously. Sergeant Ernie Savage was still directing the defense when the rescuers arrived. He had been awake for over 30 hours straight, wounded multiple times, but he had held his men together through the longest night of their lives. For his actions during those terrible hours, Savage would later receive the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. But the cost had been devastating. Lieutenant Herrick and 11 others from the platoon would never go home. While Alpha Company was conducting the rescue, reinforcements were arriving at Landing Zone X-Ray in large numbers. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry was being airlifted in throughout the morning. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry was also arriving. Moore would soon have 3 full battalions on the ground with supporting artillery. The balance of forces was finally shifting in favor of the Americans. But the North Vietnamese weren't giving up. They still had fresh troops moving into the area. Senior Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Hue, commanding the North Vietnamese forces, was convinced he could still achieve victory if he could concentrate enough combat power. He ordered his regiments to continue attacking. Throughout November 15th and into the 16th, there were constant skirmishes and firefights around the expanded perimeter. Snipers, small unit probes, brief, violent exchanges of fire that erupted without warning. Moore used his additional battalions to expand and strengthen the defensive position. Companies pushed out methodically into the jungle, clearing fields of fire, destroying enemy positions, recovering weapons and equipment from the dead. The grim work of combat continued. The helicopters never stopped flying, in and out in a constant stream, bringing supplies and reinforcements, taking out wounded and dead. The pilots and crews showed extraordinary courage. They knew that every approach to X-ray was under observation and often under fire from enemy positions. But they came anyway, again and again. Many helicopters were hit. Some crashed. Pilots and crew chiefs were killed and wounded. But the others kept flying. The bond between the infantry and the helicopter crews was forged in fire during those days, a bond that would last for the rest of their lives. By late afternoon on November 15th, Moore felt reasonably confident that he could hold Landing Zone X-Ray indefinitely against any attack the North Vietnamese could mount. But higher headquarters had other plans. On November 17th, orders came down for the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry to move overland to a new landing zone designated Albany, located several miles to the northeast. The battalion commander was Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade. His unit had arrived at X-Ray on the 15th, but hadn't been in the heaviest fighting. McDade decided to move his battalion by foot march through the jungle rather than wait for helicopter transport. It would save time and assets, he reasoned. It was a decision that would lead to catastrophe. At approximately 1 p.m. on November 17th, McDade's battalion was strung out in a long column moving through dense jungle toward Albany. Security was inadequate. The men were tired and perhaps overconfident after the victory at X-Ray. They had no idea they were being shadowed by a large North Vietnamese force that was looking for revenge at T-115 in the afternoon. With McDade's column stretched out over 500 yards of jungle trail and completely vulnerable, the North Vietnamese attacked. It wasn't a probing action or a skirmish. It was a full-scale ambush executed with devastating precision by hundreds of enemy soldiers who had been tracking the American column and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The attack was catastrophic. Within the first few minutes, the American column was cut into isolated segments. Radio communications between units broke down completely. Officers and NCOs were specifically targeted and killed in the opening volleys. Entire platoons found themselves surrounded and cut off from the main body. What followed was a massacre. For hours, small groups of Americans fought desperately for their lives against overwhelming numbers at point-blank range. The jungle was so thick that artillery and air support were nearly useless. Pilots couldn't see through the triple canopy to identify targets. Forward air controllers couldn't mark enemy positions without hitting friendly troops. It was chaos in its purest, most terrifying form. Soldiers fought with whatever they had. When they ran out of ammunition, they fought with knives, entrenching tools, and their bare hands. Some men played dead among the corpses of their friends, waiting for a chance to escape. The fighting continued through the afternoon and into the night. By the time relief forces fought their way to the area the following morning, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry had been virtually destroyed as a fighting unit. 155 men were dead, 124 wounded. Many others were missing. It was the highest casualty rate of any